Well, thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, Anna, for inviting us all here and for inviting me to speak to you. So I'm delighted to address you at this occasion. The theme, diplomacy, power and wealth. And my subject is Count Brühl, and I think he scored high on all these qualities. My talk is a sort of continuation of an address or a talk I gave to you a few years ago, which was leading up to the restoration of this splendid centerpiece that you see here, which was acquired by the V&A in 1870, and it was recently restored, and it's now, it can now be seen in all its splendor in our Europe 1600 to 1815 galleries. It was, oh, I have slides, of course, yes. The whole talk is centered around this man, Count Heinrich von Brühl, who started his career as a silver page, a fantastic term that reminds me of Rosenkavalier, of course, but that was under August the Strong, but he rose to dazzling heights under his son, Frederick August II, to become prime minister in 1746. Brühl, as Brian already gave the preview, was responsible for all diplomacy and for the cultural affairs and for entertaining at the court. And all these things go, of course, beautifully hand in hand together. And they were incredibly important for Saxony, which was a relatively small and at that time quite poor and weak little country. And they had quite a strong and ambitious neighbor in Prussia. So it was very important to force alliances with big, important nations in Europe. And Brühl was the man to do that. And the way they went about it in the court in Saxon was trying to outdazzle almost every other court in Europe, really by building up fantastic paintings collections, splendor in every sense. And Brühl was the man for that. He had a very good taste and a sense of theater. He also had brilliant advisors in Count von Heineken, who was his personal secretary, but also Lorenzo Algarotti, one of the great minds and tastemakers of the time, also advised Brühl. He had a passion we all know here about for porcelain, for instance, had thousands of pieces. As director of the Meissen factory, he could order whatever he needed for his entertainment program, free of charge. And of course, he had clothing, snuff boxes, paintings, prints, enormous library, everything, and buildings, of course. He built quite a substantial amount of palaces from Dresden to Warsaw and in between. And through a curious fate, I mean, nothing has survived really, almost of that, but this one has. It's his relatively small summer palace in Friedrichstadt, just outside of the center Dresden, therefore it still stands. And it was basically a very small entertainment palace with a huge formal French-style garden where Brühl would entertain internationally, but if he was abroad, then other members of the court could use it for the same purpose. It had a little shooting range here, and it had a little theater, but for this talk, mostly important is at the main axis from the little palace there, the central room, there was this magnificent Baroque sculptural fountain, 40 meters wide, sculpted by Lorenzo Mattielli, and Mattielli was the court sculptor at that time, and he was an Italian who really was instrumental in bringing the neoclassical taste in sculpture to Dresden. But even before the fountain was finished, it took several years, especially the plumbing up was quite difficult. He gave a verbal command to the Dresden Meissen factory to make a small model of it as a table decoration, and he asked Kentler to do that, and work for that lasted throughout 1745 and 46. And the result can be seen here. As I said, it was acquired in the museum in 1870, and it was part of a large group of white porcelain that contained this piece. Not everything was there. We made up about 15% of it with new pieces, but there was also a lot more. this kind of splendid centerpiece used at very spectacular dinner parties at the dessert course was, of course, a way for the Saxon state to show off their sophistication and their wealth, but it was also very much a calling card for the Meissen factory. All the dignitaries from foreign countries would see such splendid centerpieces, which were often made just for the one occasion. It had to be very exclusive. And they would write home about what they saw, and actually orders of Meissen porcelain would follow. And it's interesting that at the time when so much was spent by Brühl and so much was ordered without payment, the Meissen factory actually was one of the rare times in history that it was profitable. So the policy worked. And I just showed a quote that from Henry Williams, the English envoy at the court in Dresden, and everybody knows that, I think, here. It's been published many times, but he describes how he sees such a centerpiece at the dinner table, running with water all the time, with scented rose water, and he thinks it's one of the best things he ever saw. And that is, Henry Williams arrives in Dresden in 47. So, because of this very importance to be seen, of course, the proceedings at the court and the most wonderful occasions are also published in the chronicles. And this is actually how I first found out where our Neptune fountain was first used, because it was actually for an extremely important occasion. It was for the very important wedding between Louis Dauphin of France and Mary Josepha of Saxony, 15 years old at that time. But I think the Dauphin was also a teenager still, so the match was good. But it was incredibly good for Dresden, because they were in a right pickle at that time financially, because they had huge war indemnities to be paid to Saxony. And as part of this very important deal, which was brokered by Brill, working together closely with the Duc de Richelieu, France would give a substantial amount of money yearly to Saxony, and that would help them to pay off these war indemnity payments. The description of the centerpiece is given here. It says that it surprised and made everybody wonder through its novelty, and it describes in the finest white porcelain, you see the cascade. It's called here the Triumph of Amphitrite, which stands in Brühl's garden. So it's a very specific one. It doesn't say that it runs with water, but there is another description as well from of these other chronicles, which is not as elaborate. You can't recognize the piece itself, but it does say that it runs with water. So we know that for sure. Just to tell something about the splendid occasion, this was the wedding happened on the 10th of January. The second day, Brühl threw this magnificent party in his paintings galleries. It started off by having an Italian-style, newly composed opera in the Zwinger, where there was an opera house erected. And then people would proceed to Brühl's gardens in the evening. This is his garden on the Elbe River, and it was totally illuminated with over 1,000 lights, and there was a huge pyramid, or obelisk we would say nowadays, erected 20 meters high, which has devices of the royal couple on it. And then people would proceed to the paintings galleries, which is in the center here. Brühl's palace, town palace, is here, and it was right near to the royal residence. The paintings galleries here to be seen in this Canaletto painting at the far left, and a detail of it here. It was a very large oblong single space with glazed windows all along the facade with the Elbe. And here is a sort of design which is not quite resolved yet, but you get the picture of it. In between all these windows were mirrors with classical sculptures and vases in front. And then the whole back wall was intended for Brühl's magnificent paintings collection. And what was not lost on contemporary commenters, and I'm sure it was important to Brühl, that this room at 87.5 meters wide and 11.5 meters deep was 14 meters longer than the famous Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. So they really wanted to do something on a grand scale. So just to talk you quickly through the chronology, as I already sketched, 10th of January is the marriage. The 21st 5th of December, that humiliating peace treaty with Prussia. Work on the fountain starts in November 45, but then I realized that the first wife of the Dauphin, Maria Teresa Rafaela of Spain, didn't die until the 22nd of July of 46, so well after the fountain had been in construction in Meissen. So it can't have been made for that occasion. So there was another, the actual engagement was announced on 6th November, and as I said, Brühl had a very important role in that, and it happened very, very quickly. Brühl, not a month later, he was elevated to Prime Minister, and I think that's very much connected because it was such an important deal he brokered. Everything went very fast. The announcement in early September, and then the wedding takes place in January the year after, so very, very quick. But there was another wedding planned in Dresden, and that was actually a double wedding. We call it a double Bavarian wedding. It was between a prince and a princess of Bavaria, with a prince and a princess of Saxony. And that was also announced already in July 46, but that had to be postponed because of this much more important French wedding came through. So my idea is that our Neptune fountain was actually intended probably for that double Bavarian wedding. Okay, well, quickly to show what I did before the restoration, there were 6 tables like this full of fragments of white porcelain, all acquired in 1870. So I had to find out what belonged to the fountain, make sure we could reconstruct the missing parts, but also find out what all the other parts were. And some we already had an idea, but I had a wonderful opportunity to spend a whole month in Dresden in 2014. And one of my research questions was to find what all these pieces are. And this is, for instance, a group, it's called the Large Danish Group. And we have 3 parts of that as part of our assemblage. And strangely enough, we have this rock here in, oh, sorry, this is, goes very fast, in duplicate. So it is a little bit of an odd thing to consider. Similarly, of the big Apollo-Bad group, we have 1 piece of groundwork. And of this other centerpiece, the Drunken Salinius, we have just 1 little rock with a little Bacchanalian child on it. But then the great centerpiece, it's a miniature of what was planted, a huge full-scale monument for August the Strong, the Reiterdenkmal. 1 was ever made of it. And of the surrounding rockwork and the base of this, we have no fewer than 20 parts, some of them in duplicate, some of them actually in triplicate. So here are some. On the left, the pieces I could see in the Porzellansammlung, and I compare them with the pieces in our collection on the right. So there are over 20 of these. And this is the plinth of the Reiterdenkmal, which we have almost complete, but some of them in triplicate, like the piece on the left. So this helped me to figure out why we have all these parts. This is where the fountain was installed after Brühl's death. Count Marcolini took over many of Brühl's responsibilities. He also became the director of the porcelain factory. He seemed to have admired Brühl a lot because he acquired his garden palace and made it into the Marcolini Palace. There in the orangery, which he improved and made into a sort of concert venue as well, he installed the porcelain table fountain that he also acquired, probably through the factory, probably in this apsis. And it was presented there as a water feature with goldfish in it, and it ran with water all the time. And that explains all the calcium deposits and all the mortar evidence that we have on these pieces. The fountain had some of that, but also all these other rock works. And it's all rock works that we really have. So I'm pretty convinced that he made a sort of background to this garden feature, which he also embellished with palm trees. He was director of the porcelain factory, so he could easily go to the stores and have duplicates of rock work. And also these trees, we have 4. And some of them also have this mortar at the base. So, but one of the more spectacular and intriguing, sorry, thank you. intriguing pieces that we have is this substantial, I call it pyramid because that's the contemporary term for it. We might say obelisk now, but it's in 3 parts. It has a base with a laurel wreath growing around it, and then, thank you, it has 2 parts. Overall, it's, I think that the top part on the left is 50 centimeters tall, so it was at least 1 meter and 30 tall. Excuse me. So I took that with me to Dresden in 2014, where I also participated with the Brill seminar at that time. And just to show how, I think for good research, you have to be also extremely lucky, but you create your luck in a way by being in the right place with the right people at the right time. So I was at the conference, and there was one paper that didn't particularly was not particularly relevant to my research. So I wondered how to sneak out without disturbing everybody. You know how that feels. But I saw Maureen Cassidy Geiger, and I don't think she's here today, unfortunately, but she did the same thing. She sneaked out, and I sort of quickly went behind her. So the door opened once only, and she said, oh, well, I've got an appointment to look at some drawings of centerpieces. If you want to come with me, you're very welcome. So, and I've been very, very grateful ever after that she asked me, because what I saw were these 2 drawings, which I immediately realized were actually a depiction, 2 views of the centerpiece that I was trying to figure out what it actually would have looked like. So it has, they're from a little bit later, they're dated around 1770, but there is no mistake that the pyramid on top there is the one that we have in our store, be it in damaged state. It's typically interesting, or you can very clearly recognize the plinth with the laurel wreath growing around it, and then, of course, the top of the pyramid with the roses. And there are 2 little holes at the top, upper end of this pyramid, and they correspond with where a little figure of a fame blowing a trumpet is attached. So the next week after the conference, I went to the Meissen factory. I had been there before and met this fantastic man, Uwe Marschner, who is the chief modeler, and he knows everything about the 700,000 plus molds that they have there. And he said, well, we've got something similar. I'm not completely sure what it is, but he took me to one of the darker recesses of the mold archive, a little cellar, and showed me this mold. And that was extremely exciting, because it was completely clear immediately that this is the mold that produced this top end of the pyramid. He said, well, don't be too enthusiastic yet, because it hasn't got a proper model number. It just says number 7, 5 pieces, 5 Stück, and that doesn't really link it to any chronology. But the same afternoon, I was in the archive in the factory, and the model book I knew already. This is a model book that was compiled in 1775, the first one that has survived retrospectively, including all the models that they still had and the molds. So there you see there is a whole page here, and it's devoted to a piece made for the Bayerisches Vermählung, the Bavarian wedding, and it includes a big, big rock with lots of rock work and a pyramid. And there you indeed have my number 7, 5 Stück. So I was extremely excited and wired that back to Mr. Marschner. And the next week, he used all his weightlifting skills to put all these huge molds together for me. These are all the molds needed, and they're enormous to make the pyramid. The middle part here, number 8, 6 pieces, and these are the other 5 pieces used for the branches that go around it. They were all there, and they are, again, corresponding to the mold book here, as does the little palm tree, which Mr. Marschner pulled out as a sort of dessert course for me. Number 23, 8 pieces, and the 8 pieces are for all the leaf work and that. So I began to have a real idea of what this magnificent table centerpiece must have looked like, with our pyramid and palm trees, an eagle, figures all around it. So the hunt was for the figures. And the mold book, luckily, it has 2 whole pages about this wedding centerpiece. And this gives all the figures that there are with their mold numbers. So, but it was not easy. In the beginning, I asked everybody, and Errol Mannis was very kind to point out this Pallas Athene figure to me. which is the one that clearly is depicted here. The subject is the Judgment of Paris. So she was one of the main contestants in that judgment. Very pleased, and I do apologize to Christie's, who've been very hosting to us, that I show a few Bonham pictures here. But yeah, this came up at Bonham's, and I managed to acquire that for the museum. The helmet needs to be restored. It's a restoration and probably can be brought back. And the same goes for Prince Paris, a very rare, I think, white figure, but it was completely a fluke that it also showed up. And it's very clearly the figure I'm looking for here. It is 33.5 centimeters tall. They're all substantial figures, you know, far beyond the normal size of small sculpture. But we don't only shop at the great auction houses. Because you have a mold number, you can search on the web. And I found this piece, which is very rare. I think it probably wasn't produced much because it doesn't make sense on its own. It's a little boy under a laurel tree. And it came up at eBay. It was made in the 20s or 30s, and that's a very important time for the Meissen factory. You had a man, Erich Hösel, there, who was a fantastic person with antiquarian interest, and he recreated a lot of the lost models. He restored molds or replaced them when they were broken or missing. So we know a lot of the history of Meissen because of this Erich Hösel, and it's from that period. So here you see how it corresponds to the little chap on the drawing there. This figure I also managed to acquire. It's a shepherd, an Ovidian, elegant shepherd. Of course, it's Prince Paris in disguise, but he came up again at auction not so long ago. This was another complete fluke discovery. I gave a lecture in San Antonio last year and had to make a stopover, so I decided Houston because I hadn't been to the museums there. I did the main museum and then had a very quick tour around Bayou Bend, their decorative art sort of country house setting, and saw this figure, which is, again, it struck me immediately because they're substantial in size and very neoclassical, and that's the figure of generosity that you see at the bottom there. But all that sort of slow hunting was sort of preceded when I went to Dresden again at the beginning of last year. And I had some time to spend in the newly set up Meissen Stiftung, where they have all the figures that belong to the factory storeroom, as it were. And they're catalogued them at the moment. So now only they know what they have. And I also was allowed to look through all the thousands of figures they have there. And so they have, all of these are made in the 1920s and 30s or some 19th century. But they are of very great interest. And I managed to find almost all the figures that I needed, so to really create a very good sense of this lost centerpiece. There was a few figures that don't exist as actual figures. For instance, the dove on top, but there is a photograph of it and the molds, and this little chappie here with a jug in its hand. Luckily, the molds, again, in the 1920s recreation survive, so this can be remade should we want that. Then there is a little boy with a pickaxe representing doubtless the riches of mining in Saxony, and I don't have a mold number for him, and I only found these Christie's figures in an auction a number of years ago, just an illustration, and then there are also a couple of those made as torchère in a wonderful ormolu setting. So well, having all this material together, we can trace the whole making of this centerpiece. And it's clear that Kendler was the main modeler who was responsible for this. These are all the models he works on in March. The work is very quick. It happens in March, April, and May, basically, of that year, leading up to this double wedding. And but what's interesting is that Kendler doesn't say that he models the figures. He cuts them up, he refines them, and he prepares them for molding, which normally happens after you model the piece in clay. So the same is true for these figures in the month after. But I'm convinced that Kendler did make them, and he must have made them quite shortly before he cut them up, because that's how it goes. You have to model the clay, and then when it's sort of leather hard, you can cut it up. And you can't wait too long. So he must have done that shortly before. Well, why is it not documented? But the answer is here. There is a document in the library, in the archive of the Meissen factory, which is called the Taxa. It's basically an account for 5 years only of all the work that Kentler did in his spare time, and he was paid for that directly. So it's not recorded in the official work reports that the workers filed every month, but it's a separate document. And it doesn't continue, sadly, in the years that I'm looking at, but the practice did. And what you see is that various models that Kentler modeled in his spare time and are in this book, if you then look at the official work reports in the factory, you see that later he cuts them up and refines them for modeling. So it's a practice that happened. So I'm convinced that Kentler modeled them, but in his free time, as it was a very busy period. And also a lot of the models created in this taxa are for the king or for Count Brühl himself. So Kentler was a genius, but he still needed some inspiration, and the factory had a huge amount of prints. I just pulled these two out because they have a good resemblance with the Juno figure. But of course, he was also very much aware of the work of Lorenzo Mattielli, who did the big stone fountain in Brühl's garden. He did lots of statues for Brühl, including this Juno figure, which was to the left of his palace entrance in Dresden. If you reverse it, it is actually quite a striking similarity with, as is the case with this Pallas Athene figure that stood to the left of his palace door. The palace is gone, but the statues have survived, luckily. And then there is this Arcadian shepherd I showed to you before, which was clearly derived on a small Ovidian print that they have, anonymous print in the Meissen archive. There's wonderful sheep. They're quite well known because they're such endearing popular models. They were modeled by Reinecke, and he also modeled the dog that goes with them, the sheepdog. So I played around with these figures in the Meissen Stiftung. It was great fun, as you can imagine. These are the model numbers. Very important is this figure of fame. I pointed out the two holes at the top of the pyramid. That's where this figure was attached. It was modeled by Kentler, but he said he couldn't quite finish it, so he handed it to his assistant Reinecke, and Reinecke 1 month later described how he finishes the fame figure that already had been begun. But he adds to it that it was the fame figure for the pyramid, for the large basin for Count Brühl. So that was my first real evidence that actually this huge centerpiece made for the double Bavarian wedding was made for Count Brühl himself. So, and this is the very final notation about this centerpiece. It is by another modeler, Eder, who he says that he helps to put it all together in Dresden. I show you this terrible slide just to heighten the academic content of my talk. I took it myself from in a dark room in a glazed print. It was in a little exhibition on Brühl. But it shows the wedding celebration decorations to the inner court of his palace. The two statues are there normally. It's Neptune and Amphitrite by Mattielli, of course. But in the middle is a temporary construction of a huge pyramid with two double portraits there and a fame figure, very much like the pyramid that we see on our centerpiece. And then, unfortunately, we don't know exactly the date. Brühl threw 4 parties, no fewer than 4 parties, just for this double wedding celebration. 2 in his summer palace, which were preceded by a German comedy performance. I'm not quite sure what that is, but the other 2 that were at the town palace were preceded by an Italian-style opera. And then people went to the garden and then back into the paintings gallery that we already saw. And I think that actually the quote that I showed before by Henry Williams might well actually be the one that describes our centerpiece in action, because he talks about the fountain of the Piazza Navona. If you look at that, it's very much a big grotto-style mount with a tall obelisk on top. A very striking feature are the river gods. But if you look at the mold books of the original fountain, they actually had 2 river gods as well. And one of them is completely lost, but it's been recently recreated at the Meissen factory here. It hasn't been cured yet, so it's a preview of what it would look when it would be fired. It's mold number 14, and there were 2, number 10 and 14. It also links beautifully to the inventory that's been much published and it actually is lost, but because of its publication it's known, of Brühl's huge porcelain collection drawn up in 1953. And there we have a large white grotto with a pyramid on top with lots of figures, and it includes actually, to add to, it says, 2 basins of the Weichsel and the Elbe, the 2 rivers, and there's also a bear there. So what I begin to realize is that the drawing that we have is of a sort of later reimagining of the centerpiece, which would have been a little bit bigger in the beginning and had more figures around it. And indeed, if you look at the model book, you can see here there are 2 rivers, Flues, number 10 and 14, and there's also a figure of a bear there. So just to round up now, what do I want to do with all this? Well, by just playing around, you can imagine how wonderful it would look if you could reconstruct this, but it's very hard to do that because so little is known. We have a few rocks and also that have evidence of the water that would have come out of 5 spots around the rockworks, but there's not enough to really recreate it. So I'm writing a book about this whole group of material, but I also would like to do a 3-dimensional virtual reconstruction. But the partnership is difficult for that because it involves scanning all these figures separately and including the molds when you don't have the figures and putting it all together. It'd be incredibly costly, so I have to figure out a way to find the funding and to find a partner who could do that. But just to whet the appetites, what I've done here is to use all the photographs I've taken from various angles to resemble the picture on the left, and mounted them on top of the drawing, as it were. So a photo montage of what it could look like if this piece was reconstructed. So that's the final slide. Thank you very much.